welcome back to my channel. Before we can start our IFR night flight, we of course need to file an IFR flight plan. I use skyvector.com for this. You can of course use any flight planner software that you have available. We're flying from Nürnberg to Frankfurt today, Echo Delta Delta November to Echo Delta Delta Foxtrot, and we're looking at the VFR chart, so let's switch over to the IFR low altitude routes. IFR, of course, meaning instrument flight rules. That does not necessarily mean that we cannot see outside. However, we are following a pre-planned flight route and we're going to be constantly controlled by ATC. Now, to get from Nürnberg to Frankfurt, we are going to make use of the low altitude IFR routes or jetways. These are predefined airways interconnecting the grid of waypoints that you can see on the screen. And low altitude means that we are flying anywhere between the minimum altitude and 18,000 feet. The maximum ceiling of the Bell 412 would be around 18,000 feet. However, it's way too high. We would need oxygen for this. So for this flight, I'm choosing a cruise altitude of 7,000 feet. Now, in order to get started, we enter our departure and destination airport into the flight plan mask on the lower left-hand side. And what we get is a direct route between Nürnberg and Frankfurt. Before we start to alter the flight plan, I'm going to quickly explain the approach and departure procedures of an airport. In order to control the in- and outbound traffic, ATC will make aircraft fly published approach and departure procedures. They're called STAR for Standard Terminal Arrival Route and SID for Standard Instrument Departure. These procedures that you can find in the published chart of the airport will terminate at specific waypoints that they are named after. When flying from Nürnberg to Frankfurt, you usually get assigned the Sukat departure, which terminates at the waypoint Sukat. Once we arrive at Sukat, we will proceed following our flight plan as filed, unless ATC wants us to do something else. Now let's alter the routing from a direct one to a routing that includes waypoints and follows along these airways. First, I'm going to include the waypoint Sukat, which will be the termination point of the SID that we most probably are required to fly. We do that by left-clicking on the magenta line and dragging it over the waypoint. On this little pop-up menu, you can click Plan for the waypoint Sukat, and it gets automatically added to our flight plan. Notice that SkyVector automatically inserts the Sukat 2 kilo standard instrument departure. Now, in the end, the departure procedure to be flown is at the discretion of the controller. From the Sukat waypoint, I could fly the T159er route to Spesa. However, I'm going to choose to fly direct to waypoint Ekput and then entering the Zulu 104 jetway. After again dragging the magenta line over the waypoint Ekput, we click Plan on the little pop-up menu and it gets automatically added to our flight plan. Next waypoint would be Lepsa along the Zulu 104 route. So again, simply drag the magenta line over Lepsa and click Plan. A few quick words about the symbols and figures on this chart. Now, the arrow on the Zulu 104 route indicates that this is a one-way route only to be flown from east to west. The figure below the arrow means the distance between the two waypoints. And if you have a figure above the arrow, that is the minimum altitude that you can fly on this IFR route. Of course, the distance is measured in nautical miles and the altitude in feet. Our final waypoint before entering the approach procedure for Frankfurt is called Spesa. Here you can see that SkyVector again automatically adds a standard arrival procedure. Just keep in mind that this is the expected arrival procedure, however ATC can make you fly a different one. Now our flight route is planned. We are going to depart Nürnberg via the Sukat 2 kilo departure, terminating at Sukat. Then we fly direct to Ekput, and then we follow the Zulu 104 to Lepsa and Spesa. At that point, we are going to enter an arrival procedure for Frankfurt Airport. So now it's time to file our flight plan on the Vatsim network. When flying GA aircraft IFR, you could also use direct routing via GPS or use VORs and other nav aids for your flight planning. So let's hop over to the Vatsim page and file our flight plan. First thing I'm going to do is go back to SkyVector, copy my intended flight route, and paste it into the route details section of Vatsim's flight plan mask. We will be fully controlled from Nürnberg to Frankfurt, so I'm going to delete the approach and departure procedures. I'm just curious what ATC will give us. Now for the rest of the details. First thing is our call sign. We will be Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India today. Next thing is flight rules. We're going to leave it at IFR instrument flight rules as opposed to visual flight rules. As aircraft type, we will use B412 for Bell 412, and our weight category is going to be light. We are not heavier than 7,000 kilograms. The equipment code lets ATC know what kind of navigational equipment you have on board. We're going to choose G. I choose G, that means we navigate via the Global Navigation Satellite System GNSS with our GPS, and we are not flying higher than 27,000 feet. Our departure and destination airports, of course, and our intended cruise level of 7,000 feet or flight level 70. Cruise speed with the Bell 412 at our current weight settings will approximately be around 100 knots. Depending on the winds, we might be a little bit faster than that, but that's what I'm calculating with. You also have to enter an alternate airport, so if anything should go wrong and you cannot land at your destination, that's the place that you would fly to instead. It should be an airport that you're able to reach with your fuel reserves, and in our case it should be one that is open at night. The estimated time for our flight will be 1.5 hours, and our fuel endurance will be 2 hours, so we have an additional 30 minutes to reach our alternate destination if need be. In order to complete our flight plan, we need to enter an off-block time, that is the time that we intend to commence our flight, as well as the alternate airport. Once you've done that, you can click on File Flight Plan and you're all set to go. Now this was a quick and dirty walkthrough on how to create a flight plan for Vatsim. If you want to dig a little deeper, there are numerous videos out there covering the basics of flight planning. So let's jump into the aircraft and get going. Alright, engines running, and we're sitting on pad 3 of Echo Delta, Delta November. As you can see, I've already hacked in the flight plan, excluding the departure procedure because I haven't been assigned one by ATC. Tonight there is no tower or ground control at Nürnberg, so our responsible station will be Munich radar. First, we will need to get our IFR clearance, which usually would go to delivery if it's online. We're going to state our call sign, our aircraft type, where we are and what we want. That's an IFR clearance, and any weather information that we have. We don't have one, so we can leave that part out. München Radar, good evening. Helicopter Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India, Bell 412 at Nürnberg, pad 3, IFR to Frankfurt. Of course, if there would be a tower online, you would not have to state that you're at Nürnberg.
Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India, München, hallo, active runway S10, QNH 1019, you cleared to Frankfurt via Rodas for Mike departure, flight plan route, climb flight level 70, and squawk 1000.
Now we need to read that back. Little tip, write that down. Clear to Frankfurt, flight planned route, climb flight level 70 via the Rodas for Mike departure, squawk 1000 and QNH 1019 Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India.
Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India, feedback correct. Report ready for taxi.
Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India. So a quick explanation of an IFR clearance. He cleared us to Frankfurt via the flight planned route, so that means that whatever flight plan we have filed, we can follow it along. If there should be a problem with your flight plan, ATC will let you know and will either give you instructions to change it or change it for you. He also assigned us a departure procedure, and it is a different one than we expected. I'm going to go to the procedures page on the GPS, select departure for Echo Delta Delta November, and then look for the Rodas for Mike departure. For inserting it into your GPS flight plan, don't forget to click load procedure. Next element of our IFR clearance was the altitude, in our case flight level 70, so cruise altitude. It could also be an initial altitude. That means this is the initial altitude that you need to climb to after departure, and ATC will give you further instructions once you reach that altitude.
Hello,
They might give you a frequency that you need to contact once airborne, so usually that's the departure frequency. However, today there's only one controller online and we're going to stay with him. In some places, as here in Germany, you are required to contact departure by yourself once airborne. There's not going to be a handover by tower. So we are not flying the standard SUCAT departure to Frankfurt. I don't know why that is. Maybe the controller will give us vectors. That means that the ATC controller will guide us through the airspace by giving us bearings that we need to fly. That is usually done to get you from the terminal waypoint of an arrival procedure to the runway, or in order to separate you from other traffic. Last but not least, the Ifr Clearance includes a transponder code which ATC will use to identify us through the remainder of the flight. Now there's a mnemonic device that you can use to remember what informations are contained in an Ifr Clearance. Just remember craft. C is clearance, we're cleared to Frankfurt. R is route, we are flying the road is for Mike departure and then our flight plan as filed. F is frequency, we're going to remain on this frequency for departure. And T is of course our transponder code. Tonight we're going to make use of the autopilot feature of the Bell 412. This is the autopilot panel here. I'm going to explain the autopilot features as we go along. However, one important thing, make sure that the autopilot is in attitude mode, not in SAS mode. Naturally, the autopilot systems have to be switched on, so autopilot 1 and 2 on. And here we can change the autopilot mode from attitude to SAS and back. SAS stands for Stability Augmentation Systems, and we're going to use that for our taxi to the runway. And once I'm airborne, I'm going to switch over to attitude mode to activate the autopilot. The autopilot is able to follow a pre-programmed flight route. That's the one that we've entered into the GPS. That's what you would call LNAV for lateral navigation. You can also control altitude via the autopilot as well as speed. That means once it's activated in the attitude mode, the autopilot will take over control of the collective for you. You can also use a heading mode, of course. So we're ready taxi, let's call ATC. Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India Nürnberg, ready taxi.
Mike India, watch air taxi to holding point runway 10 via Juliet, Foxtrot and Delta. Report ready for departure.
Air taxi to holding point runway 10 via Juliet, Foxtrot, Delta and report ready for departure. Delta Mike India. So it's already pretty dark outside. Visual reference is poor, to say the least. I hope I'm gonna taxi to the runway all right. Now the SAS will help us out a little bit, stabilizing the aircraft. Juliet, Foxtrot and Delta are taxiways. You can find those on the airport diagram, or if you just zoom in a little more on the Reality XP. However, I know my way around this airport, so I know where to go without looking. Now on the upper left corner of our map on the GPS, you can see the desired track, DTK, which is 096 degrees. So if you're flying manually, that is the bearing that you should fly in order to follow the pre-programmed departure route. However, we're going to hand over the flying to the autopilot once we're airborne. In the upper right corner, you can see the bearing that you are flying now. We are just turning north, turning onto taxiway Juliet. The lower right corner gives you the distance in nautical miles to the next waypoint, and the lower left corner you can see the ground speed. So not the indicated airspeed as you would read it on our speed gauge, but the actual ground speed. So what is ground speed? Let's imagine you're flying along at 100 knots indicated airspeed, so 100 knots through the air. However, you have a tailwind of 10 knots. That tailwind will make you faster, so your ground speed will be a little higher than your indicated airspeed. Vice versa, if you have a headwind, your ground speed might even be a little bit slower than your indicated airspead. Same thing goes for boats in water actually, so if you're up against the current, your speed through the water will be greater than your speed over ground. And if you're running with the current, of course, your speed through the water will be lower than your speed over ground. Now we're nearing the holding point of runway 10. I'm trying to put it on the ground here, however it is pretty hard to maintain a stable hover because visual reference is rather poor. Once we are down, we're going to make our final checks and report ready for departure. Whoops, still oscillating quite a bit. And we're down. Alright, external lights are on, throttles are at max. All gauges in the green, we have enough fuel. Landing light is on and the transponder is set to mode Charlie. So we're ready for departure. Let's give ATC a call. Delta Mike India holding short runway 10 at Delta, ready for departure.
Delta Mike India, Roger, wind 107, that is 6 knots, runway 10 cleared for takeoff.
Runway 10 cleared for takeoff, Delta Mike India.
Canadian Air Force 152 request feedback.
Canadian Air Force 152, sorry, I just saw that I made a mistake on your clearance. You're cleared out of runway 08 left via Rudak 1 Quebec departure.
The Quebec departure. Canadian Air Force 150.
Runway 08 left.
08 left, runway.
152, read back correct, and pushback approved.
Pushback approved, yeah, Canadian Air Force 150.
Now we're accelerating, keeping an eye on the torque gauge.
643, Roger, wind 14, that is 8 knots.
So once I've set my attitude for a climb, I'm going to switch the autopilot mode from SAS to attitude. Just done that. Now I have to set my altitude. I'm going to click on the altitude knob and dial in 7,000, or a higher number that we are at right now. And I also need to set the vertical speed. Just click on VS and then dial in a maximum of 900 feet per minute. It would reduce the workload if you could set the altitude on the ground. Well, you can do that, however, for some weird reason, once I get airborne, the autopilot system seems to reset that altitude. Maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but yeah. Time to click the nav button. That means that the autopilot now takes over lateral navigation as programmed in our flight plan. It's important that on the GPS you're in the GPS mode. You can see it on the bottom there in magenta. Now you might have noticed that the autopilot banks the aircraft rather aggressively, so this would definitely be pretty uncomfortable for the people inside the aircraft, but that's the way it works here. Looking at the torque gauge, it's pretty high. We should get that lower. Probably the speed is a little bit too high, so the aircraft tries to hold a speed that it cannot possibly hold during a climb, so we need to reduce the speed as well.
Mike India, report passing altitude.
ATC wants to know what altitude we are currently passing through. Passing 2,400 feet, Delta Mike India.
Mike India, Roger, identified.
Identified means that he has us on his radar screen.
Goodbye. 3 Romeo Whiskey, contact Langen 124.725.
Now we can see that the rotors for Mike departure gets us pretty much opposite to where we want to go, and we would need to make a very tight turn. However, I think that he will give us vectors really soon and get us on our way to Stuttgart or Frankfurt. After using the autopilot panel to set the desired airspeed to approximately 100 knots, we can see that the torque gauge now is well within the green. You should constantly monitor the torque gauge because the auto thrusts of this autopilot will overtorque the engine if you're not careful. As I said, it would be nice if I could set the initial altitude, my airspeed, and the vertical speed while I'm on the ground. However, I could not make that work. Every time I did that, it was reset once I was airborne. Maybe one of you guys know what's the deal with that.
Delta Mike India turn, now left heading 360.
Turn left 360, Delta Mike India. Alright, we got ourselves a vector. He wants us to turn left to 360 degrees. So we're going to use the heading knob on the HSI, turn the heading bug to 360, and then activate the heading mode on the autopilot panel. Keep in mind that the aircraft is now not following the pre-programmed route from the GPS. It simply flies the heading that we set with the heading bug on the HSI.
Delta Mike Tango, proceed direct to Sukat.
Was that for Delta Mike India?
Yeah, sorry, Delta Mike India, proceed direct to Sukat.
Direct Sukat, Delta Mike India. Alright, we can fly direct to waypoint Sukat now. I'm going to load up my flight plan here, scroll down to the waypoint Sukat. I have to re-enter Sukat into our flight plan because it's not in there because we got a different departure procedure assigned. I'm going to go to my next en route waypoint, which is Ekput. Click on it and choose Insert Before. Then type in Sukat. There it is, and once it is inserted in my flight plan, I'm going to click on it, press the Direct to button on the GPS and activate. In order to fly direct to Sukat now, I need to change back from the heading mode to the nav mode on the autopilot panel. We can see the airport on our 11 o'clock position, and we are still climbing to our cruise level of 7,000 feet. As we crossed 5,000 feet, which is the transition altitude of Germany, I should have set the altimeter to 1013, so to standard altitude. Below the transition altitude, you use the altimeter setting of the current airfield you're at, or whatever ATC tells you to set it to. Once you're above the transition altitude, you're going to set it to standard, so 29902 or 1013 hectopascal. That system simply assures that all the aircraft that are flying have the same altitude reference. In the US, I think the transition altitude is at 10,000 feet. Now the autopilot flies the aircraft along the programmed waypoints. There's not much to do for you, except checking the gauges, making sure the autopilot does work correctly. It can be a little bit boring sometimes, so I don't really do IFR flights with helicopters. As you've seen in my videos, I'm just flying VFR most of the time. However, I wanted to make an episode covering IFR flying. For IFR flying, in real life, you would need an IFR certified aircraft. This Bell 412 certainly is. Other aircraft that you could use is the Rotorsim EC35. I think it has an autopilot as well. And the AW139 or 109 by X-Rotors probably would be a good ship for IFR flying. Now there's not much happening in cruise flight. Once we leave the airspace of Munich radar, ATC will hand us over to the next center controller, which will be Langen radar. Once we're nearing the aerodrome, Langen radar will hand us over to Frankfurt approach, and they will have us fly along a transition or a star, a standard terminal arrival route, and they might give us vectors to intercept the ILS of the runway that we're supposed to land on. ILS stands for Instrument Landing System, and it gives you vertical and lateral guidance to fly a perfect glide path onto the runway. Each ILS-equipped runway has its own frequency that you need to tune your nav radio to, and you can find all the information about your ILS approach in the published charts of your aerodrome. Maybe a quick word about ATC coverage on Vatsim. If you load up a flight at an airport that has all stations manned, you would get your IFR clearance from delivery. That's how it's done in real life. However, on Vatsim, we not always have all controllers online, so if there is no delivery frequency online, you would get your IFR clearance from the ground controller. If there's no ground, you would get your clearance from tower, and if there's no tower, you get your clearance, as we did today, from the center controller. So if a station in the chain is missing, you go up to the next higher controller, and if there's no controller online whatsoever, you use Unicom. So we are finally at our cruise level. I've increased the speed to about 120 knots indicated airspeed by using the speed button on the autopilot panel and then dialing in the desired speed. Just make sure that you do not over-torque the engine by choosing a speed that is too high. On the GPS you can see that our ground speed is at 137 knots, so we are quite a bit faster than expected. Now I don't know what will happen in Frankfurt, to be honest. I expect the Spesa 3 Charlie arrival or something like that. However, yeah, I told you this is my first IFR flight in a long time, so let's see what happens. I'm going to split this flight into two videos, the first one being the departure from Nürnberg and the second one being the approach into Frankfurt. In between there's not too much happening, the autopilot simply follows the waypoints, so it's not too exciting. You'll get the occasional handover from one controller to the other, but that's it. I'm using Reality XP's GPS payware add-on. It's a very good simulation of the original Garmin GPS. You can also go a long way with X-Plane's custom GPS system. Only thing is that you cannot enter user waypoints, which is very convenient from time to time. And it might also have a quite outdated database, so you will not find a certain approach and departure procedures or waypoints in there. With Reality XP's GPS you can create user waypoints, and it also features quite a lot of waypoints and even visual reporting points, which is also very handy for VFR flying. However, its database also, I believe, is not the latest one. The RXP GPS works pretty much like its real counterpart, so if you want to learn more about it, you can also check out the YouTube videos from Garmin. I'm using the GTN 750 here. The ATC phraseology for IFR flying is, after all, pretty modular and repetitive, so it's not going to be too difficult once you get the hang of it. You probably heard a lot of those phrases already while you were waiting for your VFR clearance. Now for IFR flying, it is of course mandatory that you can control your aircraft and that you have knowledge of the autopilot functions. Now ATC sometimes requires you to fly holding patterns at certain waypoints, so I'm going to quickly show you how to set that up within the GTN 750. What you do is you go over to the flight plan page and you select the waypoint that you want to hold at, left click it and choose hold at waypoint. Now on this page you can configure your holding pattern as instructed by ATC or choose a default one and then simply press load hold in order to insert it into your flight plan. Unfortunately with X-Tridents Bell 412 following the GPS into a holding pattern is not possible, so you would have to fly it manually.
Contact Langen on 125.2, bye-bye.
Over to Langen 125.2, bye-bye Delta Mike India. So we're leaving the airspace of Munich radar. I'm going to switch over to 125.2 and call up Langen radar. On my initial call to the next controller, I'm going to use my full call sign again, so Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India, not just Delta Mike India, which was abbreviated by the previous controller. I also will advise on my altitude as well as on my current position along the filed flight route. Langen radar, helicopter Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India, inbound Zucat, flight level 70.
456, reduce speed 220 knots. 220 knots for 456. The 47 uniform, reduce speed 220 knots, contact arrival 12535. The 212535, that's the 7 units, corrected for 7 uniform G. The 456, contact arrival 12535, ciao. 12535 for 456, next search and access. Delta Hotel Oscar Mike India, Langen radar identified.
This was the handover to Langen Radar, and this concludes part 1 of our IFR night flight experience. Stay tuned and join me for my approach into Frankfurt in part 2. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and see you around.